All right. You can tell it is the holidays because there's no one here tonight. But thank you guys who did come out this evening. We're going to continue our Bible study on the book of Joshua. We started this week in chapter 7, and we're trying to get through chapter 13. No, chapter 7, right? 7, 8, 9? No. I can't remember. Either way, tonight we're doing 10, 11, 12, and 13. So we ended on Sunday morning, ending at chapter 9, where the story, the events around the Gibeonites and how they tricked Israel into signing a treaty with them. And tonight we're starting in chapter 10, and that's when the Amorites attack the Gibeonites. So at the end of chapter 9, Israel ends up making a treaty, and then Joshua kind of curses the Gibeonites because of it, and they make them the water carriers and the woodcutters for the Israelites. And then beginning in chapter 10, we read about the king of Jerusalem hears about the destruction of Ai and the treaty that the Israelites made with the Gibeonites, and he's getting a little afraid. So he makes this alliance with 5 other kings of the Amorites. Let me get to my slide before I get too ahead of myself. And so, oh wait, I'm way behind. Sorry, hang on. Okay, here we go. So the king of Jerusalem hears about the destruction of Ai and the treaty that the Israelites made with the Gibeonites. He contacts 5 other kings of the Amorites, and they make an alliance. One of the interesting things why the king of Jerusalem reaches out and contacts these other kings, the city of Gibeon was a much larger city than Ai, and they were known to have warriors. So, from the standpoint of these other Amorite kings, you got this group of people that is coming through and defeating everyone, destroying them, and now they've made an alliance with this other huge city who is made up of warriors also. So you can imagine the other kings around the area are kind of getting worried about that. So they make this alliance with 5 other kings, and then they go and start to besiege Gibeon. I'm going to do that a bunch because I kept saying that earlier. They go to besiege Gibeon, and then Gibeon calls out for help from Joshua. So you can see how, this is already coming back to bite them. God told them not to make treaties with anyone in the land, and now they've made this treaty, and now they're having to fight with this other Canaanite city against these other Amorites. So what does God tell Joshua in verse 8? God tells Joshua something in verse 8. Well, don't fear them, exactly. He says, don't fear them. I've handed them over to you. And he says a phrase that he'd said before too. He says, not one of them will stand against you. No one will stand against you. So again, encouraging Joshua that he's going to be with them and that they can defeat this army. So Joshua marches all night long. They surprise the Amorites. And so how does God intervene in this battle? In verse 10, it tells us how God intervenes. How does he intervene? Yeah, he sends them into confusion, and they defeat the entire army of the Amorites. And how did that happen? Was it like a miraculous confusion where they just confused because all of a sudden now, the Israelites are there all of a sudden and kind of snuck up on them? Who knows? Either way, this army is much larger than the army of the Israelites, and they defeat them and send the Amorites running. So there's two miracles that happen here as the Amorites are running away. One of them is that, I think I skipped something. No, we're good. One of them is that God sends hailstones down. And so as the Amorites are running away, these hailstones fall down. How successful was the hail? What's the Bible say about how successful it was? More people than they killed with the sword. So what do you think, what's the implication there? Yeah, exactly. That God's the one who's winning this battle. And I think we'll see that we've seen that over and over again in the story of Joshua, but just re-emphasizing the fact that God's the one who is fighting this battle for them. And so the other miracle that we see is that the sun and the moon stand still in verse 12. as I was thinking about this, so why do you think that would have been helpful? So the Amorites are running away, they're pursuing them, and they're kind of trying to go, I would imagine, going back to their city, right? They've been defeated, they're trying to go back home. Why would the fact that it doesn't become night, why would that be helpful to the army?
They're exposed as they're trying to run away and anywhere to hide.
Exactly, like no one's got night vision, right? No one's got night vision goggles. So when it gets dark, they can't really fight anymore. It's much more difficult for them to fight. Much easier for the Amorites to hide. And so the Israelites pursue the Amorites, and they end up defeating them all because of this miracle where the day it doesn't turn night. And there's a sentence here that says in verse 14, "There has been no day like it before or since when the Lord listened to a man, because the Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal." So I thought that was interesting, the idea that there's never been a day like this before when God listened to man, and God, Joshua asked God to have the moon and the sun stand still. How that happened, who knows? I don't know exactly how that happened, but it did, and God took control there. Any comments on that so far?
Aaron, I think one thing that we see with the sun and all standing still is that we need to have the faith to ask, but it has to be in the same alliance with God, not just what we want. But I think that's the whole purpose of that, because in verse 10, the Lord routed them. It says.
That's exactly right.
It fell into alliance with what God wanted, and I think that's where our prayers, it's not about me, but it's for the purpose of God.
Yeah, and I think that's, you talk about your will being aligned with God's will. Like that's when we're really, in the zone. when we can make our will the same as what God wants. That's exactly right. All right. So I have several maps tonight. I'm hoping that you'll be able to see them. I was talking to Bryce. One of the very frustrating things about this lesson was trying to find maps that had cities on them that are in the Bible. Because there's like 10 cities you'll read, and you look at all these maps, and none of the cities are actually on the map. So hopefully the cities I have, the maps that I have are accurate, because every map's a little bit different. But this is a map of the southern campaign. So this is what we're talking about now with the Amorites. So when they're here at Gibeon, as they flee, it talks about the idea of the ascent. They chased them through the ascent of Beth Horon and then the descent of Beth Horon. And I was reading on that and trying to figure out what that was. They think that this is a mountain range in here, and so as they came across, they chased them kind of up the mountain range and then down the mountain range. And that's actually where the hail happened and all that kind of stuff. And so these are all the cities of the different kings here: Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Debir, and Hebron. And they chased them all the way to Azekah, and then Makeda. I'm going to totally mispronounce these though. But that entire way down is kind of where they're traveling, chasing them away. And then what happens? So they defeat the army, but some people get away. Who gets away and hides in a cave? So the 5 kings, they kind of leave the battlefield and they run away, maybe even faster, or to some degree they get to where they can hide. So they hide in a cave. And so what does Joshua tell the Israelites to do there? Cover it up. He's like, leave them here. We've got stuff to do. We got to go chase after all these people that are running away. So they cover up the cave with rocks, and then they go and defeat the rest of the Amalekites. I keep messing up the words. Amorites. I've said Amalekites a bunch of times too. This was interesting, and I read this so many times trying to figure out the order of these events. Because when you read it, so in verse 15, after it talks about the day that the sun stood still, it says that the Israelites went back to Gilgal. But then there's this other whole section about how the execution of the 5 kings. And then they go back to Gilgal. So I don't think they went back to Gilgal and then came back and found the kings in Makeda. What I think happened, and please correct me if you find it differently, is they chased them down here. The kings are hiding in the cave here. They covered up the cave, and then they go and destroy the rest of the people. And then they come back to the cave to get the kings. That's kind of what I'm putting together. I'm not exactly sure if that's the way it happened, but it doesn't make sense that they would leave Makeda, go back to Gilgal and then come back and defeat the rest of the cities. So I think what happens is, they cover the cave, they go through and they destroy everyone. You see at the end of the chapter, it says, on that day, if you look at verse 28, it says, on that day Joshua captured Makkedah, struck it down with a sword, including its king, completely destroyed it and everyone in it, leaving no survivors. And that's actually where the kings were hiding. And I think they just went through all the rest of the cities and destroyed the rest of them and then came back and killed the kings. Any comments on that? Did you guys read, when you were reading that, were you having trouble figuring out the order? Because I was back and forth trying to figure that out. Okay. I'm getting ahead of myself again. So the Amorite army is defeated, or is being defeated. The 5 kings hide in the cave. They cover the cave. They go back and destroy all the rest of the Amorites. And then when they come back to the cave, Joshua says, okay, bring all of these kings out. And then what does Joshua tell the commanders of his army to do after he brings all the kings out? Put your foot on their necks. Do you think there's any significance to the fact that he himself didn't put his foot on their neck? He had his commanders do it. This may be me reading too much into it, but I thought that was interesting. And you think about a leader, right? It seems like this is kind of like decentralized command, right? He's saying, okay, you guys are the commanders, my kind of other commanders of the army. These are your enemies. This is exactly what God's going to do for all of your enemies. And so he kind of gives them that confidence that God gave him, right? God came and talked to Joshua and said, listen, no one's going to stand before you. You're going to destroy all these people. And he kind of does the exact same thing for his commanders. He tells them, put your foot on their necks. And this is exactly what's God. It says in verse 25, do not be afraid or discouraged, but be strong and courageous, for the Lord will do this to all the enemies you fight. And when you think about the fact that this is kind of the beginning of a huge amount of battles that they're going to go through and taking out all the cities of Canaan, almost all the cities of Canaan. And this is kind of a pivotal point where he's like, all right, listen, be strong and courageous. God's going to do this for all of the rest of these battles. And so I think it's kind of a little bit of a morale boost, kind of giving those commanders the same encouragement that he got through God. I think another thing to think about is, these commanders, who are the Israelites, right? They're not this well-trained army that's been fighting all these, huge battles. Not too long ago, they were slaves in Egypt. Then they're wandering in the wilderness. They're nomads. Now they're all of a sudden becoming this army, and they've had success. But to be honest, it hasn't really even been them. I mean, think about Jericho and the way that they won those battles. Now they're actually going to have to really start fighting to some degree, much more than they may have in the past. And when you think about the Canaanites that they're fighting, these people, like we talked about before, have been fighting a lot. They're fortified cities. They fight amongst each other a lot. And so a lot of these cities, they have big armies who are used to fighting. And so, that kind of confidence that they would be getting through Joshua telling them, God's going to do this to all of your enemies, definitely would have been helpful. The other thing to think about is, what did Joshua, or what did the other 10 spies, when Moses sent out the spies at Kadesh Barnea, what did the spies say that came back? Yeah, they're huge, right? They're giants. And you think about, they even talk about the Anakim, I'm probably mispronouncing all these words, but the Anakim that are in the area. So these aren't, these are big, strong cities that they're going to fight. And so this kind of a little bit of a morale boost, I think, was definitely helpful. All right, any comments on that? All right, so they go through, after they kill the rest of the kings there at Makkedah, they go to Libnah, they destroy that city. They go to Lachish, they destroy that city. Eglon, Hebron, Debir, all the cities they go through, destroy all of the people in the cities. If you look at verses 28 through 40, what are some repeated phrases we keep seeing over and over again here? So I'm so glad you picked up on that. That was super interesting because a lot of the cities, he talks about they besiege them, right? They came into the city, they besieged it. That's usually a long process. You surround the city, you got to wait till they have to come out. It's like you're kind of starving them for supplies. But almost everyone, it's like that day they took the city. The next day they took the city. Exactly. And obviously that's not something a normal army, that's God's intervention there that happened that quickly. What else do you see in those verses? Yeah, that's exactly right. It was everyone, and when I read that, I thought, it's everyone's on the same page now, right? You think about what happened at AI and all that kind of stuff. People were kind of still not really. Now everyone's got focus. God's with us. We're going to go get this done. That's exactly right. Just as the Lord had commanded, exactly. That's the phrase. The theme of this entire book, right? That success comes from following God. They were following God. One of the things I saw was the Lord handed this city over to Israel. The idea that no survivors were left. I mean, we see that over and over again. They killed everyone, totally demolished the entire cities. Even the idea that they killed this king just like they had killed this king. So it was like they did the exact same thing. Each city, they listened to God. They did what they were supposed to do, and they were successful. So when you look at these battles, actually we kind of already talked about this. I was going to say what seems different between these battles and AI. We kind of already talked about that. The fact that they were listening. They were doing what God wanted them to do, and they were being successful. All right, so after that, Joshua, they capture all those cities. Joshua and the Israelites return to Gilgal. That's kind of their home base. And then we see at the beginning of chapter 11, what happens here? Kind of the same thing that happened at the beginning of chapter 10. Yeah, so everyone's hearing about it, right? Even the cities of the north are hearing about what's happening in AI and what's happening with the Israelites, and they're like, okay, hold on, we got to get a group together because they're going to come after us next. So, kind of this, it's similar that there's one king who's kind of like the head king of that area. King of Jerusalem was in the southern kingdoms, southern kingdoms, and then of the north, Hazor was kind of the main city of that area. So King Jabin of Hazor. He contacts these other kings in the northern kingdoms, and they all bring their armies out to fight against the Israelites. And if you, oh man, yeah, you really can't see that, sorry. So all of these lines are all the other cities that come together, all the other kingdoms that come together with the king of Hazor to fight at, what was it called? Merom. Right here, I think it was the plains of Merom, I apologize. But that's where they decide to meet to fight against the Israelites. And let me go back a little bit. So in verse 4, how is this combined army, how is it described? How big is it? Yeah, as many soldiers as the sand on the seashore. So you can imagine all of these different kingdoms coming together to fight against Israel. So this huge army comes together. And there's something else that differs in this, that the Bible says in this battle or in this army than we hear in the other armies. What else do they talk about having? Horses and chariots, exactly. And so you think about that phrase, horses and chariots. What does that, well actually, I forgot this. So I thought it was interesting when you think about what God told the children of Israel when they were going to go into the land. In Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 1, it says, when you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army larger than yours, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt is with you. And so exactly kind of what God told them was going to happen is exactly what's happening. And so you can imagine this much smaller army, they're going to the fight. It's like all these other kingdoms come together and make this huge army, and it's not like they're going to go find the Israelites. The Israelites go after them. So they go up into the north to fight this army. And God tells Joshua to do something to the army of the Canaanites. What does he tell them in verse 6 to do to the army of the Canaanites? He tells them to hamstring their horses and to burn their chariots. And so when you think about this idea of horses and chariots, it's talked about a lot in the Old Testament. It's talked about in the prophets. and this may be a bad question, but what do those symbolize? What do horses and chariots symbolize in the Old Testament?
Looking for like power and wealth.
Exactly, like military might, right? Like those are the big kingdoms. They have horses and chariots. What did God tell his kings about horses? When I think it's in Deuteronomy. Yeah, it is in Deuteronomy. He says, you're going to have these kings. What does God tell the kings not to do?
How many horses and chariots?
Yeah, don't acquire a bunch of horses. And why is that, Brian? Why does he tell them that?
So you don't start putting faith in yourself.
Exactly. Oh, look at all my horses. Look at all my chariots. This is my battle. This is my army. And so God tells them, don't have your kings, don't do that. Because I'm the leader of your army. I'm the one who's going to fight your battles for you. So I think it's interesting that they're going against this huge army, and God tells them, hamstring their horses, burn their chariots. Kind of like, I'm in charge here. I'm the one who's going to win this battle. Not these chariots and horses. In Deuteronomy 17, that's where it came from. I had it in my notes right here. That's where the Israelites are warned to not have a king that will acquire many horses. It even talks about like not going back to Egypt to get those horses. And then in Psalms 20 and verse 7, it says, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. And so God's telling Joshua, hamstring the horses, burn the chariots. That symbolizes God's power over the perceived power of the Canaanites. So what does Joshua do to the city of Hazor that he doesn't do to the other cities that he had captured in the northern and southern campaigns? It talks about it in verse 11. So he goes through and they fight the Canaanites. They run away. They start to go and destroy the cities. But he does something different to Hazor than he does to the other cities. He burns it. And he did this to Ai. Is that right, John? Or Jericho. I couldn't remember which one.
They burned Jericho.
Jericho, not Ai. Because that was the one I was supposed to talk about, the pottery that they had found. They've actually found artifacts that showed evidence of being burned in the city of Jericho. But so they burned the city of Hazor. Why do you think God would tell them to burn the cities? I guess he didn't necessarily specifically tell them to burn the cities, but God did tell them to totally destroy the cities. So what would be the significance of burning a city? Why would you do that? That's not a good question. I'm just going to state it. I told Bryce, I said, I ask a bunch of questions because it kind of helps me to remember what I'm going to say next. But the idea of burning the city is utterly destroying it so that city can't come back, right? And actually talked about the fact that Hazor, as opposed to these other Canaanite cities, was really never a power again. They never came back to be an influence in that area, and they were the main city in Canaan, or in the northern part of Canaan. And after Joshua burns it, they never really become an impact. Why would God want that? Why would that be good for the people of Israel? Why did God not want them to intermarry with people?
Because they were afraid that they would change their belief in God.
Yeah, they would pull them away to their gods and into idolatry, and we see that over and over again. And so, the fact that Joshua does that here and it works, right? God knew what he was talking about, like destroy these cities completely so they cannot influence you and pull you away.
So they did burn Ai also. Another reason would be God has a lot of work for them to do yet, and so it might be tempting to want to, say, hey, that house looks pretty nice. Actually, I could probably live in that house. You could probably live in that house over there. I think it would distract them from accomplishing what God wants them to do.
Just knock out this wall here and look at this space.
Already has a vineyard.
Exactly, right? That's exactly right. Yeah, kind of distracting them from the work God had already planned for them. That's exactly right. And in Deuteronomy chapter 20, however, you must not let any living thing survive among the cities of these people the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. You must completely destroy them, the Hittite, the Amorite, Canaanite, Perizzite, Hivite, and Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they won't teach you to do all the detestable acts they do for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. I think that's the key part of that. That was going to make sure that they weren't influenced to draw them away from God. All right. So what do we see in verses 12 through 23 here of chapter 11? So Joshua captured all these kings, all their cities, struck them down with the sword, completely destroyed them, as Moses, Lord's servant, had commanded him. So he does exactly that. He destroys all the cities, he kills all the people, totally eliminates the Anakim, which were what? What are the Anakim? Giants, right? So those are the giants. They go in and kill all the Anakim, except, where do they leave a couple of them? Say it a little louder. Gath, Gaza, and Ashdod. Who do we know from those cities? The Philistines. Who's a giant of the Philistines? Right? Goliath, exactly. He's from Gath. So we see this where, they kill almost all of them, but they leave some. And what happens? What is Goliath known for? Obviously the fight with David. But before that, what's he doing to the Israelites? He's taunting them. He's causing all these problems with the Israelites. They're afraid of him. They won't even go out and fight him. And so you see here where they don't do what God tells them to do, and it comes back to bite them. And we'll see that several different times. There's another, in this chapter, another situation. Actually, not this chapter. I think it's 12. Where they don't do exactly what God told them to do, and they have repercussions because of that. All right, so Joshua goes through and eliminates all of these cities. And then in chapter 12, it talks about, actually, I guess I pushed through that a little bit too fast. Hang on one second. Sorry, I could have got lost in my notes there. I want to talk about this a little bit too, because Renee and I were talking about it before worship. We see this phrase over and over again that Moses, just as Moses had told them, just as Moses told. And Renee was like, I thought Moses was dead. He's like, yeah, that's right. Moses was dead. So what's this idea? How is Moses telling them these things? What's the point of that? Why does he keep saying that over and over again?
What do you think that Moses was the one that led them out of Egypt? Moses was their leader. So if that's what Moses said, unfortunately we as humans look to someone like that. So if that's what Moses said to do, then that's what we should do.
Yeah, I think, and definitely, so who told Moses, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, verse 15 is good. It kind of stood out to me when I read this. It says, just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it.
That's exactly right. That's actually the next sentence I was going to read. That's exactly right. So like they're talking about the origin, right? Everyone knows God told Moses, he was our leader, and we're doing exactly what Moses told Joshua to do. It's kind of that, going down the line, the word came down from God to Moses, then to Joshua, and Joshua was doing exactly what God had told Moses to do, fulfilling everything that God had told them. Exactly right. All right, any other comments? I know I went through a ton of material there, and maybe a little too fast. Sorry, go ahead.
It also just makes me think of Moses had told them, we will take the land. And the spies came back and said, we can't. So I feel like it's just a reminder too, like, we are doing exactly what Moses said God was going to do through us.
Yeah.
Be reminded of that. God didn't forget, like, reminding them of the punishment and reminding them that we told you this way back and you guys ignored us. So now we're doing it.
Yeah.
Conquering the land.
Yeah, and how encouraging that would have been, right? They, all the way back then, when Moses was with them, God told them this was going to happen, and now it's coming to pass. That's exactly right. Any other comments on that?
Aaron, I want to say, I think there's a good comparison too that we see that you were talking about Deuteronomy with the horses and the chariots. We saw in Numbers with David getting in trouble for taking a census, which was a reliance on his own might opposed to God.
That's exactly right.
Time and time again.
Yeah, it's funny. As I've been reading this, there's so many of those themes you see over and over again that God talked about in the very beginning when they first come into the land, that come back later on in the First and Second Kings and Samuel and all those things that continue to bother them, that God told them was going to be problematic. I did want to read this. So in verse 14, it says, "The Israelites plundered all the spoils and cattle of these cities for themselves, but they struck down every person with the sword until they had annihilated them, leaving no one alive. Just as the Lord commanded his servant Moses, Moses commanded Joshua. That is what Joshua did, leaving nothing undone that the Lord had commanded Moses." And I think one thing that struck me as I read this was just that the annihilation, like that they killed everyone, which was a little troubling sometimes. As I kept reading that, I thought, man, that's pretty significant, right? Everyone. But that's exactly what God told them to do. And sometimes doing what God wants you to do is hard, right? It's not easy to do a lot of times. Not a lot of times. Sometimes it's not easy to do. But Joshua was faithful. Joshua was a good leader, and he led the Israelites to do exactly what God had asked them to do. All right. No, I'm on the right one. All right, so chapter 12 and 13 are really just delineations of what they had done. It's kind of a recap of the conquest of the north and south, and then how they divide up the land in chapter 13 as well. It gets a little bit more specific in the later chapters. Actually, I think in chapter 13 they go through Reuben and Gad and Manasseh as far as the boundaries. But then as we go through 14 and 15, I think we get all the rest of the tribes and kind of where their boundaries are. But in chapter 12, he talks about the kings that were conquered in the land of Canaan. So they start out with the kings that are east of Jordan, Sihon and King Og. So who fought against King Sihon and King Og? Did Joshua do that? Yeah. So that was with Moses. So Moses is the one. That was when Moses was still there. They fought against those kings, and that's actually the lands that Reuben and Gad and Manasseh, after they destroyed those kingdoms, they were like, hey, we like this land, let's stay over here on the east side, and God gave them that land. Exactly. And then in verses 7 through 24, it talks about the territory west of the Jordan. And it's very interesting. It kind of recaps every king, right? King of Jericho, the king of Ai, the king of Hebron, the king of Lachish. Every king that they defeated, it kind of recounts exactly what had happened. Why do you think this is important? Why would God want to remind the Israelites of this? Maybe that's too easy of a question. I mean, so we're recounting, right? God's done this for you. This is the victory that God has given you. All of these different kings that you've defeated, 31 kings in all, just west of the Jordan. So, I mean, it's a huge undertaking. And I think when you look back at the map, I thought it was further. I mean, it's a huge amount of territory. So they come across here at Gilgal, come down here, all of southern Canaan, all the way up here, all of northern Canaan, and they defeat all of it. Take all of the land in a relatively short amount of time. And so when you think about if they had to go through and go to each kingdom individually and fight them, don't you think that would have taken even longer? How did God accomplish that more efficiently? He brought them all together, exactly. And the Bible talks about that God hardened their hearts that they would fight against the Israelites. It's like God had this planned out perfectly. Both times, multiple kingdoms come together at one fight, and God destroys them all. And then same thing in the northern kingdom. Multiple kingdoms come together, destroys them all. And obviously they go back through and kind of take over those kingdoms and burn the cities or destroy the cities. But in one fell swoop, kind of takes care of a lot of the fighting men all in one spot. And I think that's very efficient, but no regular army could do that, right? I mean, if you got 6 different kingdoms that come together and make one army, one single army is not going to defeat them. That's kind of the reason why those kings got together, because they thought that, hey, if we get all together, we're going to be able to defeat the Israelites. But through God's power, obviously God takes care of that. So through the end of chapter 12, pretty much just talks about all the different kings that were defeated, and then you move on to chapter 13. Oh, yeah, I forgot I'm way back here. Sorry. And we talked about the unconquered lands of Canaan. So starting on in chapter 12, or chapter 13, talks about the fact that Joshua is getting older, he's advanced in years, but there's still some areas that are unconquered. But God says, even though they're unconquered, go ahead and start dividing the land up, and we'll get rid of those people later on. So some of the places that were unconquered, this took me forever. I was super frustrated about this. Trying to find the places that he names, I couldn't find barely any of them. So they named some of the land of the cities of the Philistines. You can see that on most of the maps where right along the coast in the southern part of Canaan where Ashdod and Gath and those cities are, they're unconquered. So that's the land of the Philistines. And we see what's the result of that? The fact that they don't defeat the Philistines. What results from that? They're the big problem. Once they come into the land, the Philistines are the ones they're always fighting with. They're always, bothering them. We have the entire issue with Goliath. So they're, a big thorn in their side. And then it talks about Mount Hermon. I think I have another map. Yes. You can't really see that one much better. But so here's those cities here of Philistia. They're unconquered. Obviously, this whole area down here. I couldn't really find any of these cities anywhere. Mount Hermon I found on some places that were up here. And it talks about like the area south of Mount Hermon was unconquered. But I wanted to say, okay, these are the exact areas that were unconquered. I couldn't figure it out. So if you guys have a better map, I would love it because it took me forever to try to find those cities. I couldn't find them anywhere. So Mount Hermon, the land of the Philistines, and some other places I couldn't find were still unconquered. But they go ahead and distribute the conquered lands in the end of chapters verse 6 in through verse 7. And it first talks about the 9 tribes and half the tribe of Manasseh, because the other half the tribe of Manasseh and the other 2 tribes had already been given their land east of the Jordan. So it goes through and talks about how that area was distributed. But the borders were only given for the land east of Jordan, because in the next couple chapters we talk about the borders for the rest of the tribes of the other tribes that are not. I'm having trouble tonight. Talks about the other tribes that are west of the Jordan. Here in chapter 13, just talks about the ones that are east of the Jordan. So there's two groups of people that are talked about that have not been driven out. The Geshurites and the Maccathites. If you remember this, that's awesome. You're a great Bible scholar. But does anyone remember how these 2 people come back to be a thorn in the side of the Israelites? The Maccathites and the Geshurites. It took me a while to figure this one out. So the Geshurites, during the time of David marries the daughter of the king of Geshur, and her name is Maacah. It's spelled the exact same as the Maccathites. It's Maacah, which is really confusing. So the princess of Geshur is Maacah, and David marries her, and their son is Absalom. And so you can see how that, obviously David's sin is a part of that, but that intermarrying, it causes a bunch of problem with the Israelites. And then Maacah, I think it's Maacah. Their contribution, or the problem that they cause to the Israelites, is they contribute warriors to fight against David when he's fighting the Ammonites. So obviously we see this over and over again where they don't do what God tells them to do, and later on it comes back to bite them. And that's pretty much the end of chapter 13. It goes through and talks about the different borders of each tribe. I didn't get into that just because I figured you can read that, me kind of telling you this border and this border. And plus, it's really hard to find a lot of those borders. So as I kind of read through it, I thought, I'm not going to go through all that. But John is going to go through some of that next class. So on Sunday, we're going to continue going through, I think it's 14 through 18 or 14 through 18, somewhere around there. So we're covering a lot of material each class. So go through and read those chapters, because it'll definitely help for more discussion, and you'll kind of know more where we're going, because it's so much material to cover. Yes, thank you.
It occurs to me that the Israelites might have had a huge mis-expectation. The land promised. This is taking a lot of effort
Yeah.
to get the land. But it requires obeying God.
That's exactly right. And much easier when they, obviously, it is effort, obviously, but they would have never been able to do that without God, what they had to do. But yeah, you're exactly right. And that such a good analogy to us that, obedience is not always easy, but it makes your life a lot easier when you obey God and do what He wants you to do. All right. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate your attention.